The moment I opened my front door, I saw my son laughing with his in-laws at my expense. My room was empty, my things gone, as if I never belonged there. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I had just returned after spending Christmas week at my sister's apartment in Brooklyn, hoping the city's festive lights and brisk winter air would calm the storm raging inside me. The musty scent of my old home should have greeted me like an old friend, but it was cold and silent. Exhaustion weighed heavy in my bones. I was 72, diabetic, and frail, but I had carried an invisible burden much heavier than age. The endless routines had become my prison. Cooking meals nobody seemed to appreciate. Refilling prescriptions for a family that barely acknowledged my existence. Scrubbing floors until my arthritic hands ached, as though my worth was measured only in what I could clean, fix, or provide. My existence had become purely functional, like a forgotten appliance gathering dust in the corner. The doorbell had rung twice while I was gone, but there were no messages waiting for me, no apologies, no welcome home. I had dreamed of returning to warm embraces, family dinner around the table, smiles that reached the eyes. Perhaps even a simple hug from my son Michael, the boy I had raised with every ounce of love in my heart. Instead, what greeted me was laughter. Sharp, cutting laughter that pierced through the thin walls of our Manhattan apartment. I stood in the hallway, my worn suitcase still in my trembling hand, listening to voices I knew so well discussing me like I was some burden they had temporarily escaped. Michael's voice carried clearly through the living room. "I can't believe how peaceful it's been without her hovering around." His wife Sarah's high-pitched giggle followed. "Your mother acts like she owns the place. It's about time she learned her boundaries." My heart stopped. These were the people I had sacrificed everything for. The son I had loved unconditionally. The daughter-in-law I had tried so hard to accept, despite her cold shoulders and cutting remarks disguised as jokes. I pushed open the door to my bedroom, the room that had been my sanctuary for the past 3 years, ever since I could no longer afford my own apartment on my meager Social Security income. The room where I had retreated each night, listening through thin walls to conversations that excluded me, plans that were made without considering my needs or feelings. It was empty, completely empty. My bed was gone. The small dresser where I kept my few remaining treasures had vanished. The photos of my late husband Robert, the ones that had comforted me through countless sleepless nights, were nowhere to be seen. Even the worn throw blanket my grandmother had crocheted, the one that had traveled with me through 60 years of marriage, motherhood, and widowhood, had disappeared. I stood there in that hollow space, feeling like a ghost in my own home. The afternoon light streamed through the bare window, illuminating dust particles that danced where my life had once existed. My reflection in the empty window showed a woman I barely recognized anymore. Gray hair pulled back in a practical bun, shoulders curved from years of bending to everyone else's will, eyes that had lost their spark somewhere between endless giving and never receiving. The laughter from the living room grew louder. I heard my son's in-laws, Harold and Margaret, making themselves comfortable in what had once been my space too. Their voices carried the confidence of people who belonged, who had a place at the table, who were wanted and welcomed. "Where did you put all her things?" Margaret asked, her tone casual, as if discussing the disposal of old furniture. "Storage unit in Queens," Sarah replied. "Cost us $200, but it was worth it to finally have some breathing room." $200. They had spent more than that on dinner the previous week at some fancy restaurant in the Upper East Side. But my entire life, my memories, my few remaining possessions, were worth exactly $200 of storage space in Queens. I remember standing there, my hand gripping the doorframe so tightly my knuckles turned white. This was the same hand that had changed Michael's diapers. The same hand that had worked double shifts at the diner when his father left us. The same hand that had signed over the deed to my small house in Newark so Michael could have money for his wedding, for his business ventures, for all the dreams that somehow never included space for me. The weight of 30 years of single motherhood crashed down on me in that empty room. I had been 18 when I married Robert, and 25 when Michael was born. Those early years were golden, filled with hope and the kind of love that makes you believe you can conquer anything together. Robert worked construction, his hands always rough but gentle when he held our baby son. I waitressed at Murphy's Diner on the highway, saving every tip in a coffee can hidden behind the flour in our tiny kitchen. We weren't rich, not by any measure, but we were happy. Robert would come home covered in dust and cement, but his eyes would light up when he saw Michael taking his first steps across our living room floor. On Sundays, we'd walk to St. Patrick's Cathedral, Michael between us, his small hands gripping ours as we navigated the crowded sidewalks of Manhattan. But happiness, I learned, can vanish as quickly as morning mist over the Hudson River. Robert died when Michael was 12, a heart attack on a construction site in Brooklyn. Sudden, brutal, leaving us with hospital bills that consumed our small savings account and a future that looked as gray as the New York winter sky. I worked 3 jobs after that. The morning shift at Murphy's, afternoon cleaning houses in the wealthy neighborhoods of Manhattan, and evenings babysitting for neighbors who needed childcare they could afford. My hands were permanently stained with coffee and cleaning solutions. My feet ached so badly some nights that I would soak them in Epsom salt while helping Michael with his homework at our small kitchen table. Every decision I made was for him. When he wanted to join the basketball team, I spent my lunch breaks for a week sewing his jersey because we couldn't afford a new one. When he dreamed of attending Columbia University, I mortgaged our little house to pay for his applications and preparation courses. When he was accepted, I sold my grandmother's engagement ring, the only valuable thing I owned, to help with his first semester expenses. "Mom, you don't understand how expensive everything is," he would say when I asked about his college funds. "Books cost $300 each. Housing is thousands. I need money for networking events, for the right clothes." I understood better than he knew. I understood that my second job now started at 4 in the morning, cleaning office buildings before the white-collar workers arrived. I understood that I had been eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner most nights, so he could have spending money for those networking events. I understood that my own dreams of maybe taking a community college course, of learning to paint like I had always wanted to, were disappearing like smoke. But I told myself it was temporary. Once Michael graduated, once he got established in his career, things would be different. He would remember all the sacrifices. He would take care of me the way I had taken care of him. The graduation day at Columbia was one of the happiest moments of my life. I sat in that massive auditorium wearing the same dress I had worn to Robert's funeral because it was still the nicest thing I owned, and watched my son walk across that stage. My heart was bursting with pride and hope. This was it. This was what all the sacrifice had been for. Michael got a job at a financial firm in Manhattan, starting salary more than I made in 2 years. He rented a studio apartment on the Upper East Side, expensive but perfect for a young professional climbing the corporate ladder. For the first time in over a decade, I allowed myself to imagine a different future. Maybe I could quit the morning cleaning job. Maybe I could finally fix the leaking roof on our little house. Maybe Michael and I could take that trip to Ireland we had always talked about, to see the places his father had described from family stories. That's when he met Sarah. She was everything I wasn't. Young, polished, from a family with old money and older connections. Her father Harold was a partner at a law firm downtown. Her mother Margaret had never worked a day in her life but somehow managed to stay busy with charity events and country club committees. Sarah looked at me like I was something that needed to be managed. During our first dinner together, she asked pointed questions about my career plans and suggested I might benefit from updating my wardrobe if I wanted to make a good impression in their social circle. I bit my tongue, remembering my mother's advice about keeping peace in the family. But each interaction with Sarah felt like a small death, a tiny piece of my dignity chipped away. The wedding was planned without my input. "You wouldn't understand the kind of event we're organizing," Sarah explained when I offered to help with flowers or catering. "This requires a certain level of sophistication." I watched from the back of the church as my son married this woman who saw me as an embarrassment. The reception was at an expensive hotel in Manhattan, where the cheapest plate cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. I sat at a table with distant relatives who barely knew me, wearing a dress from Goodwill that I had altered myself to look presentable. Michael's speech thanked everyone who had helped him achieve success. He mentioned his professors, his mentors, his new in-laws who had welcomed him into their family. He never mentioned me. That night, alone in my little house, I cried for the first time since Robert's funeral. But I told myself it was just wedding nerves, just the stress of such a big event. Once they settled into married life, things would improve. They didn't. The visits became less frequent, then practically non-existent. Phone calls were brief, usually requests for money disguised as sharing family news. "Mom, Sarah's pregnant and we need to move to a bigger place. Could you help with the security deposit?" "Mom, the baby needs so many things, and daycare is incredibly expensive." "Mom, Sarah's parents think it would be better if you didn't visit so often. The baby needs routine." Each request came with assurances that it was temporary, that they would pay me back, that family helps family, but the paybacks never came, and slowly, my savings account dwindled to nothing. The house in Newark, the one Robert and I had bought with such hope and scraped to pay for over 20 years, was remortgaged twice to help with their expenses. My small stock portfolio, built coin by coin from diner tips over decades, was liquidated to help with the down payment on their Manhattan apartment. I told myself I was investing in my son's future, in my grandchildren's security. Surely when I was old and needed help, they would remember. Surely the love I had poured out would come back to me when I needed it most. The first grandchild, Emma, was born on a rainy Tuesday in October. I remember racing to the hospital, my heart full of excitement about meeting this new little person who would carry our family forward. But visiting hours were strictly limited, and I was made to understand that Sarah needed recovery time without too much stimulation. I glimpsed Emma through the nursery window, tiny and perfect, with Michael's dark hair and what looked like Robert's stubborn chin. But when I tried to hold her, Sarah's mother was already there, arms extended, grandmother rights apparently assigned by social status rather than blood relationship. Perhaps you could visit next week, Margaret suggested with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. When things are more settled, next week became next month, which became a carefully scheduled rotation of visits that gave me exactly 1 hour every other Sunday afternoon to spend with my granddaughter. I would arrive with small gifts bought with money I couldn't afford, and leave feeling more isolated than when I came. When little James was born 2 years later, the pattern was already established. I was grandmother by biology, but not by relationship. The children didn't run to me with scraped knees or exciting discoveries. They didn't beg for stories about their grandfather Robert or ask about their family history. They were polite, well-rehearsed, and emotionally distant, trained to see me as a peripheral figure rather than a central part of their lives. The financial requests continued, growing larger and more frequent. Mom, private school for Emma costs $30,000 a year, but she's so bright we can't waste her potential. Mom, we found this perfect house in Westchester, but we need help with the down payment. Mom, Sarah's been wanting to start her own business. Just a small loan to get things going. Each time I said yes. Each time I told myself this would be the last time, that after this sacrifice, things would be different. But my bank account grew smaller while their demands grew larger. The breaking point came when I could no longer afford the mortgage payments on the house in Newark, the same house where Michael had learned to ride a bicycle in the backyard, the same kitchen where I had made birthday cakes from scratch every year until he moved away, the same bedroom where Robert and I had dreamed about our future together. Mom, you don't need such a big place anyway, Michael said when I called him in tears about the foreclosure notice. You're getting older. It makes sense to downsize. Downsize. Such a clean, efficient word for losing everything you've built over a lifetime. I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, trading 40 years of memories for a monthly rent I could barely afford. The move happened on a Saturday. Michael came with a rental truck, but he spent most of the time on his phone handling work emergencies, while I packed up a lifetime of belongings. You're keeping all this old stuff? Sarah asked, holding up a box of photo albums with obvious distaste. It's just clutter, really. You should learn to let go of things that don't serve you anymore. I wanted to tell her that those photos were the only proof I had that Robert and I had ever been young and hopeful, that Michael had once looked at me with unconditional love, that I had once been a person with dreams and dignity, rather than just a bank account to be depleted. But I stayed silent, as I always did. The one-bedroom apartment was clean, but soul-crushingly small. The neighbors were kind but busy with their own lives. I would sit by the window that faced an alley between buildings, watching pigeons nest on the fire escape, wondering how my life had become so small and quiet. The loneliness was suffocating. Days would pass without meaningful conversation. I found myself talking to the television, responding to game show hosts and news anchors who couldn't hear me. The grocery store checkout clerks became highlights of my week, brief moments of human interaction that I stretched as long as possible with small talk about the weather or sale prices. Phone calls from Michael became monthly check-ins, brief and functional. How are you feeling, Mom? Everything okay? Good. That's good. Listen, I can't talk long, but Sarah wanted me to ask if you could help with Emma's summer camp fees. It's educational, really important for her development. I started saying no sometimes. Small no's at first, testing the waters. I'm a little short this month, honey. Maybe next time. The responses were swift and cutting, guilt delivered with surgical precision. I thought family was important to you, Mom. I thought you cared about Emma's future. But I guess I was wrong. Click. Dial tone. Days of silence until I called back to apologize and ask how much they needed. The pattern continued for 3 years in that small apartment. 3 years of shrinking savings, growing isolation, and an increasing sense that I had somehow become the villain in my own family's story. When I mentioned feeling lonely, I was being dramatic. When I asked for more frequent visits, I was being needy. When I suggested family dinners or holiday traditions, I was being demanding. Your mother needs to understand boundaries, I overheard Sarah saying during one of their rare visits. They were talking in the hallway, thinking I couldn't hear from the kitchen where I was preparing lunch they would barely touch. She can't expect us to manage her emotional needs. We have our own lives. My emotional needs. As if wanting to spend time with my son and grandchildren was some unreasonable burden, rather than the most natural thing in the world. The final blow to my independence came when my landlord raised the rent beyond what my Social Security could cover. Even with the part-time job I had taken at a local drugstore, standing on my arthritic feet for 6 hours a day, organizing shelves and smiling at customers, I was falling behind on bills. "Mom, you obviously can't manage on your own anymore," Michael said when I called him about the rent increase. "Sarah and I have been talking. You should move in with us. We have that small room off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's better than you trying to live beyond your means." The small room off the kitchen. In their beautiful apartment with high ceilings and huge windows overlooking Central Park. The room that had been designed as storage space, barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser. No window, no privacy, no dignity. But what choice did I have? I sold what little furniture could be sold, donated what couldn't fit in a room the size of a large closet, and packed my life into 3 suitcases and a handful of boxes. Michael and Sarah stood watching as I made my final selections, choosing which memories were important enough to keep and which would be abandoned. "You really don't need all those photo albums," Sarah said, not for the first time. "Digital storage is so much more practical." She didn't understand that those albums weren't just photos. They were proof that I had existed, that Robert and I had been real, that Michael had once been a little boy who drew me Mother's Day cards and told me I was beautiful even when I came home exhausted from double shifts. That small room became my world. Meals were at their schedule, following their dietary restrictions and preferences. Television watching was in the living room, but only shows they approved of, and only when they weren't entertaining guests who might be uncomfortable with an elderly woman hovering around. I learned to make myself invisible, to time my showers when they were out, to eat quietly and clean up immediately, to retreat to my tiny room when their friends came over, because Sarah felt it was awkward having her mother-in-law present during adult conversations. My grandchildren, now 8 and 6, treated me like live-in help rather than family. "Grandma, can you make me a snack? Grandma, where are my socks? Grandma, Mom says you're supposed to help me with homework." Never, "How are you feeling, Grandma?" Or, "Tell me about when Dad was little." Or, "I love you." Just requests and expectations, as if my sole purpose was to serve their convenience. The breaking point should have been the birthday. My 72nd birthday fell on a Thursday in March. I woke up early, as I always did, and made breakfast for everyone before they started their day. Michael was rushing to catch the train to his office downtown. Sarah was getting the children ready for school. Emma was complaining about a math test. James couldn't find his library book. Normal family chaos, except no one remembered it was my birthday. I waited all day. Surely Michael would call during lunch, or Sarah would mention it when she came home from her weekly tennis lesson. Surely there would be a card from the grandchildren, or at least acknowledgement that this day was different from any other. Nothing. That evening, I sat in my small room, looking through old photos of birthdays past. Robert surprising me with roses and a chocolate cake when we were newlyweds. Michael's handmade cards from elementary school, covered in crayon drawings of hearts and stick figures. The surprise party my friends at the diner had thrown for my 40th, complete with a banner they had painted during their break. Those friends had scattered over the years, some to retirement in warmer states, others to nursing homes or graves. The diner had closed and become a chain coffee shop. The community I had known was gone, replaced by strangers and indifference. I called my sister Rose in Brooklyn, the only family member left who still spoke to me with genuine warmth. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she said immediately when she heard my voice. "How are you celebrating?" I couldn't speak at first. Someone had remembered. After a day of feeling completely forgotten, someone had remembered. "They forgot," I whispered finally. "What do you mean they forgot?" "Michael, Sarah, the children. No one remembered it's my birthday." The silence on her end was heavy with understanding. Rose was 5 years older than me, a widow too, but she had never had children. Sometimes I thought she was luckier for it. "Pack a bag," she said finally. "Come stay with me for a while. Brooklyn's beautiful this time of year, and I've got that sofa bed in the living room." I looked around my tiny room at the walls that felt like they were closing in a little more each day, at the single window that faced the apartment building's air shaft, at the life that had become smaller and smaller until it was barely recognizable as living at all. "I can't just leave," I said. "They depend on me. Emma has a school project due next week, and James has that dental appointment, and Sarah's book club is meeting here on Saturday." "They depend on you," Rose repeated. "What do you depend on them for?" The question hung in the air like smoke. What did I depend on them for? A roof over my head? Yes, but one that came with conditions and constant reminders that I was there by their charity rather than by right. Food, but only what they chose to provide and only when it was convenient for them. Company, but the kind that made me feel more alone than actual solitude. I'll think about it, I said. Don't think too long, Rose warned. Life's shorter than we like to pretend. That conversation planted a seed that grew slowly over the following weeks. I began to notice things I had trained myself to ignore. The way conversations stopped when I entered a room. The way my suggestions for family activities were dismissed without consideration. The way Sarah would roll her eyes when Michael showed me any small kindness, as if affection toward me was a betrayal of their marriage. I started keeping a journal, documenting the small cruelties and large indifferences that made up my daily life, not out of self-pity, but out of a growing need to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining the coldness, that I wasn't being dramatic or ungrateful. Asked if we could have Sunday dinner together as a family, I wrote one evening. Sarah said they preferred to keep weekends free for spontaneous activities. When I suggested I could cook, she said I don't understand their dietary preferences well enough. Offered to take Emma to the park while Sarah had her hair appointment. Sarah said Emma needs structured activities, not just wandering around with nothing to learn. James had nightmare about monsters under his bed. When I went to comfort him, Sarah appeared and said I was interfering with his emotional development. Children need to learn self-soothing. Page after page of documentation that I was unwanted, unwelcome, and unnecessary, except when physical labor or financial assistance was needed. The financial requests hadn't stopped even after I moved in with them. If anything, they had increased. As if my presence in their home gave them greater claim to whatever money I had left. Mom, Emma needs a new laptop for school. They're doing everything on computers now. Mom, we're thinking of renovating the kitchen and your contribution would really help. Mom, Sarah's been wanting to take a photography course and it would mean so much to her if you could help with the fees. My savings account, once modest but steady, had dwindled to almost nothing. The small pension from Robert's construction union was barely enough to cover my medication and personal expenses. I had given everything I had, materially and emotionally, and still it wasn't enough. The request that finally broke something inside me came on a gray Tuesday in November. Mom, Michael said, settling into the leather armchair across from the small dining table where I was sorting through a coupon book, trying to find ways to stretch grocery dollars. Sarah and I have been talking about Christmas this year. My heart lifted slightly. Maybe they were planning something special. Maybe they wanted to include me in holiday preparations the way families are supposed to share traditions. We've decided to take the kids to Sarah's parents' house in the Hamptons for Christmas week. They've rented this amazing place right on the beach, and the children are so excited about building sandcastles in December. I waited for the next part of the sentence, the part where he explained my role in these plans, the part where he asked what I thought about spending Christmas at the beach, or mentioned that Sarah's parents had extended the invitation to include me. That sounds wonderful, I said carefully when he didn't continue. The children will love seeing the ocean in winter. Right, Michael said, looking slightly uncomfortable. The thing is, it's going to be pretty crowded with both families there, and Sarah's parents specifically planned activities for just the immediate family members. Immediate family members. I wasn't immediate family. I was something else. Something peripheral. I could spend Christmas with Rose, I said quickly, trying to make it easier for him. She's been wanting me to visit for the holidays. Actually, that would be perfect, Michael said, his relief obvious. And Mom, while you're gone, Sarah was hoping to use your room for her sister who's coming in from California. She's going through a divorce and needs somewhere quiet to stay. My room, the storage closet off the kitchen that I had tried to make homey with family photos and a small lamp from the old house. The space that was barely large enough for me was apparently perfect for Sarah's sister, who was going through a difficult time and deserved privacy and consideration. I packed for Brooklyn with hands that shook only slightly. One suitcase with enough clothes for a week. A small bag with my medications and the few toiletries that were truly mine, rather than shared family supplies. The photo album I kept by my bed, full of pictures of Robert and young Michael and holidays that felt like they had happened to someone else entirely. We'll call you Christmas morning, Michael said, kissing me briefly on the cheek as I waited for the cab to take me to Grand Central. The kids will want to tell you about their presents. Sarah hugged me too, the kind of brief, obligatory embrace that said more about appearances than affection. Enjoy your sister's place, she said. Sometimes a change of scenery is exactly what we need. I settled into the taxi, watching their apartment building disappear as we navigated the Manhattan traffic toward the train station. Part of me felt guilty for the relief that was washing over me. For the first time in months, I was going somewhere I was actually wanted. Rose lived in a fourth-floor walk-up in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Her apartment was small but warm, filled with plants and books and the smell of whatever creative cooking experiment she was trying that week. She had been a high school English teacher before retirement, and her walls were covered with thank you notes from students and photos from classroom celebrations over the decades. "You look tired, sweetheart," she said, taking my suitcase and leading me to her living room where the sofa bed was already made up with fresh sheets and extra pillows. "When's the last time you slept through the night without worrying about someone else's needs?" I honestly couldn't remember. That first night in Brooklyn, I slept for 12 hours straight. No one woke me asking for help finding something. No one needed me to start breakfast before they left for work or school. No one required me to move quietly through morning routines so as not to disturb their sleep. I woke up naturally, with sunlight streaming through Rose's large living room windows that faced the tree-lined street. I could hear children playing in the small park across the way, their laughter mixing with the sounds of traffic and city life, but it felt different from the noise of Manhattan, gentler somehow, more human-scaled. "Coffee's ready when you are," Rose called from the kitchen. No rush, no schedule, no expectation that I would immediately start meeting other people's needs. We spent that first day walking through Prospect Park, feeding ducks at the lake, talking about everything except the obvious. Rose was wise enough to know that healing doesn't happen through forced conversations, but through simple presence and gradual opening. Christmas Eve, we attended midnight mass at St. Augustine's, a beautiful old church where the congregation knew and welcomed Rose as a regular member of their community. People smiled at me, included me in casual conversation, treated me like a person rather than a burden or an obligation. "Your sister's been telling us about you," said Maria, an elderly woman who sat in the pew behind us. "She's so proud of all the work you did raising your son on your own. Single mothers are heroes, I always say. Heroes." When was the last time anyone had used a word like that about me? Christmas morning, Rose and I exchanged small gifts over coffee and pastries from the bakery down the street. Nothing expensive or elaborate, just thoughtful tokens that showed we had been paying attention to each other's interests and needs. Rose gave me a beautiful journal with a soft leather cover. "For recording whatever thoughts you want to keep private," she said with a significant look. I gave her a scarf I had knitted in secret during the long evenings in my tiny room at Michael's apartment. Something to do with my hands while I listened to their conversations and tried to stay invisible. The phone call from Michael came at noon, exactly as promised. I could hear the sounds of beach and wind in the background, the children's excited voices as they described their morning of present opening and sandcastle planning. "Grandma, I got a new bike," Emma said when Michael handed her the phone. "It's red and has streamers on the handles." "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," I said. "I can't wait to see pictures." "Dad says you're having your own Christmas with your sister. Are you getting presents too?" The innocence of the question hit me unexpectedly. Yes, I was getting presents. I was getting conversation and consideration and the gift of being seen as a person worth including rather than accommodating. "Yes, baby," I said. "I'm having a beautiful Christmas." James took the phone next, chattering about seashells and the dog they had met on the beach that morning. Normal grandparent-grandchild conversation, except that it felt precious because it happened so rarely. Michael came back on the line as the children ran off to continue their beach adventures. "You sound good, Mom," he said, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard in years. Genuine attention, as if he was actually listening to me rather than just waiting for the conversation to end. "I am good," I said, and realized it was true. "Rose taking good care of you? We're taking care of each other." There was a pause. In the background, I could hear Sarah calling for him to help with something. The children asking for attention, the normal demands of family vacation management. "I should go," he said. "But Mom, we'll see you when we get back." After I hung up, Rose and I spent the afternoon cooking together. Nothing fancy, just the kind of meal that happens when two women who know their way around a kitchen decide to create something warming and satisfying without pressure or performance. "Tell me about Robert," Rose said as we peeled potatoes. She had known him, of course, but they hadn't spent much time together during the years when I was consumed with young motherhood and financial struggle. I found myself talking about things I hadn't thought about in years. Robert's habit of singing while he shaved in the morning, the way he would leave little notes in my lunch bag when I worked at the diner, his dreams of someday opening his own construction company, being his own boss, building something that would last. "He would have been proud of how you raised Michael," Rose said. "Would he?" The question came out before I could stop it. "Would he be proud of how Michael treats me now?" Rose stopped peeling and looked at me directly. "Robert would be heartbroken about how Michael treats you now, but he would be incredibly proud of the mother you were when it mattered most. Those are two different things, sweetheart." That distinction, between the mother I had been and the treatment I was receiving now, had never occurred to me before. I had been carrying the weight of both, as if Michael's current coldness was somehow proof that my years of sacrifice and love had been inadequate. You gave him everything you had, Rose continued. You gave him more than most children receive in a lifetime. What he chooses to do with that gift, how he chooses to treat you now, that's about who he is becoming, not about who you were as his mother. The week in Brooklyn passed like a gentle dream. Rose and I visited museums and walked through neighborhoods where I felt anonymous in the best possible way. No one knew me as the burden, the obligation, the elderly mother who needed to be managed and accommodated. I was just a woman enjoying the city with her sister. We went to the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, even though it was winter and most of the plants were dormant. But the conservatory was warm and green, full of tropical plants and the sound of water from small fountains. I sat on a bench surrounded by orchids and remembered myself as someone who had once found joy in simple beauty. You could come live here, you know, Rose said one evening as we watched an old movie together. The couch pulls out into a real bed, and there's room in the bedroom for another dresser. It wouldn't be fancy, but it would be peaceful. The offer hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. Live here, away from Michael and the grandchildren, away from the constant feeling of being needed, even if that need felt more like being used. What kind of mother abandons her son? I asked. What kind of son abandons his mother? Rose replied. Because that's what's happening, sweetheart. You're living in his house, but you're completely abandoned emotionally. At least here, you'd be lonely with dignity instead of lonely with constant reminders that you're unwanted. On New Year's Eve, Rose and I watched the fireworks over Manhattan from her rooftop. Other neighbors had gathered there too, sharing champagne and resolutions, and the simple pleasure of being part of a community that actually functioned like a community. At midnight, as the city celebrated around us, I made a resolution I didn't share with anyone. I would go back to Michael's apartment, but I wouldn't go back as the same woman who had left. Something had shifted during my week in Brooklyn. Some part of me that I had thought was permanently lost had stirred back to life. Thank you, I told Rose as we headed back downstairs. For what? For reminding me who I used to be. The train ride back to Manhattan felt different than the one that had brought me to Brooklyn. I wasn't running away from something anymore. I was returning to something, but with new eyes and a different understanding of what I deserved. The apartment was exactly as I had left it, but somehow it felt smaller and more oppressive after the open warmth of Rose's place. Michael and Sarah were back from their beach vacation, tanned and relaxed, full of stories about perfect weather and family bonding. How was Brooklyn? Sarah asked, but her attention was already elsewhere, sorting through mail and checking messages that had accumulated while they were away. Wonderful, I said. Rose and I had a lovely time together. Something in my tone made Michael look up from his phone. You sound different, Mom. Do I? I unpacked my single suitcase in the small room that had temporarily housed Sarah's sister. There were still signs of another person's presence. Different toiletries in the bathroom, sheets that smelled like unfamiliar perfume, the sense that my space had been occupied by someone who was welcomed rather than merely tolerated. That first night back, I lay in my narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of family life happening around me, but not including me. Sarah and Michael talking quietly in their bedroom about work stress and social obligations. The children playing video games in the living room, their laughter bright and carefree in a way that used to make me happy, but now just emphasized how separate I was from their joy. But instead of the familiar ache of loneliness, I felt something else. Observation. Assessment. The beginning of what Rose would have called critical thinking about my situation. The next morning, I made breakfast for everyone as I always did. But when Emma asked me to pack her lunch because she didn't like what Sarah had prepared, I heard myself saying, "Ask your mother to help you fix what she made. I'm sure you can work it out together." Emma looked startled. So did Sarah. So did I, honestly. But I continued making my own breakfast, humming slightly under my breath. "Mom, Emma needs help with her lunch," Sarah said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who expected immediate compliance. "I heard her," I said calmly. "I'm sure you can handle it." The exchange lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like a tectonic shift. For the first time in 3 years, I had declined to automatically meet a demand that wasn't really my responsibility. Small changes followed over the next few days. When James couldn't find his library book, I suggested he retrace his steps instead of immediately beginning my own search. When Sarah mentioned needing someone to wait for the cable repair technician, I said I had plans to visit the library that afternoon. I didn't have plans to visit the library. But after I said it, I realized I wanted to have such plans, so I went. The neighborhood branch library was small and friendly, staffed by librarians who treated patrons like welcome guests rather than interruptions. I wandered through stacks I hadn't explored in years, picking up novels and memoirs and books about travel to places I would probably never see, but could at least visit in imagination. "Can I help you find anything specific?" asked the young librarian at the information desk. "I'm looking for books about—" I paused, not sure how to phrase what I needed. "About starting over. About women who change their lives later in life." She smiled with genuine enthusiasm. "Oh, we have a whole section on reinvention in second chapters. Let me show you." I left the library with an armload of books and a library card that felt like a small declaration of independence. For the first time in years, I had claimed space for my own interests, my own curiosity, my own intellectual life. That evening, instead of retreating to my small room immediately after dinner cleanup, I settled in the living room chair with one of my library books. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances. This wasn't part of my usual routine of invisible helpfulness. "What are you reading, Mom?" Michael asked. "It's called Late Bloomers," I said. "About women who discovered new purposes after age 60. "That's nice," Sarah said in the tone people use when they're not really listening. But I caught her looking at the book cover with what might have been curiosity. Over the following weeks, I continued making small changes. I started taking walks around the neighborhood without asking permission or explaining where I was going. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, something I had always wanted to try but never allowed myself time for. The pottery class was revelation. Working with clay, feeling it respond to pressure and intention under my hands, was completely absorbing in the way I remembered work being before it became drudgery. The other students were a mix of ages and backgrounds, but we shared the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful and functional from raw earth. "You're a natural," said the instructor, an energetic woman named Carol who had been teaching pottery for 20 years. "Have you worked with clay before?" "Not since elementary school," I admitted. "But it feels familiar somehow." "Art often does," Carol said. "It's never too late to rediscover what feeds your soul." I made my first bowl during the third class. Nothing fancy, slightly lopsided, glazed in simple blue. But it was mine, created by my hands for my own satisfaction, rather than to meet someone else's needs or expectations. I brought it home with the tentative pride of someone sharing a new and fragile part of herself. "That's nice, Mom," Michael said when I showed it to him. "Very rustic. Rustic. Not beautiful or impressive or evidence of unexpected talent. Rustic, which felt like a polite way of saying amateur and unimportant." Sarah didn't comment at all, but I caught her examining the bowl with the expression she usually reserved for Emma's art projects. Indulgent assessment of something cute but temporary. I put the bowl in my small room, where I could look at it and remember the feeling of creating something entirely my own. The changes I was making were small but noticeable, and they created a subtle tension in the apartment's established routines. When I wasn't immediately available to handle whatever small crisis or convenience someone needed, they had to solve problems themselves or ask for help rather than simply expecting service. "Mom, where did you put the iron?" Sarah asked one morning when I was getting ready to leave for pottery class. "Same place it's been for 2 years," I said, not stopping to retrieve it for her. "Hall closet? Second shelf? Could you just grab it for me? I'm running late." "So am I said, and left for class. These moments felt huge to me, even though they were objectively tiny. Each time I declined to automatically accommodate someone else's lack of planning or laziness, I was reclaiming a small piece of my own time and energy. But I was also creating awareness of how much of my daily life had been absorbed by other people's needs. Without my constant availability as backup support, they were discovering how much they had been depending on my invisible labor. "Your mom's been acting strange lately," I overheard Sarah telling Michael one evening. They were talking in their bedroom, but the walls in the apartment were thin and sound carried easily. Strange how? Less helpful, more selfish. Yesterday, she went to that pottery class instead of staying home to let in the grocery delivery. Selfish. The word hit me like a physical blow. I was being selfish because I had prioritized a creative class I paid for, with my own money over unpaid labor for their convenience. "Maybe she's just trying new things," Michael said, but his voice carried uncertainty. "Michael, your mother is 72 years old. This whole pottery phase is embarrassing, and she keeps reading these books about women finding themselves or whatever. It's like she's having some kind of midlife crisis 20 years too late." I sat in my small room, listening to my daughter-in-law explain to my son why my attempts to cultivate interests and independence were problematic and embarrassing. Not concerning or worth supporting, but embarrassing. That night, I wrote in the journal Rose had given me, documenting not just the conversation I had overheard, but my own reaction to it. For the first time, instead of feeling crushed by their disapproval, I felt something closer to pity. These were people whose sense of order and comfort depended on my diminishment, my growth, my independence, my simple pleasure in learning something new. These things threatened them because they revealed how much they had been taking for granted. The realization was simultaneously liberating and heartbreaking. I thought about calling Rose to talk through what I was feeling, but instead I made myself a cup of tea in my blue pottery bowl and sat by the window watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness. For the first time in years, I felt like I was having a real conversation with myself, listening to my own thoughts without immediately analyzing how they might affect other people. The financial requests hadn't stopped during this period of small changes. If anything, they seemed to be increasing, as if Michael and Sarah sensed my growing independence and wanted to reassert their claim on my resources before I became completely unmanageable. "Mom, Emma's been accepted to this amazing summer program at Columbia," Michael announced over breakfast one morning. "It's expensive, but it would be such an incredible opportunity for her." I sipped my coffee from my handmade blue bowl and waited for him to continue. "The thing is, it costs $5,000, and with everything else we have going on, $5,000. More than half of what was left in my savings account. That does sound like an incredible opportunity," I said neutrally. Michael smiled, recognizing what he thought was my usual agreement to whatever financial request was being made. "I knew you'd understand. Emma is so smart, and she deserves every chance to develop her potential." "She absolutely does deserve every chance," I agreed. "You and Sarah must be so proud that you're able to provide this opportunity for her." The smile faltered slightly. "Well, we were hoping you might want to contribute." As her grandmother, "I want Emma to have wonderful opportunities," I said. "But $5,000 is a lot of money, and I need to be more careful about my finances now that I'm getting older." The silence that followed was heavy with shock. In 3 years of living with them, I had never declined a financial request, never prioritized my own security over their desires. "Mom," Michael said carefully, "Emma is your granddaughter. Yes, she is, and I love her very much. But loving someone doesn't mean I'm required to pay for everything they want." Sarah looked up from her phone with an expression of pure incredulity. "Michael, your mother just said she won't help pay for Emma's summer program." "I heard what she said," Michael replied, but his voice was confused rather than angry. "I said I need to be more careful with my finances," I clarified. "I didn't say I don't love Emma or want good things for her, but you're her parents. Summer programs are your responsibility, not mine." The word responsibility hung in the air like an accusation because, in a way, it was. I was pointing out that they had been shifting their parental financial responsibilities onto me for years, positioning my money as a resource they could access, rather than a security I needed to protect. "We're not asking you to be responsible for everything," Sarah said, her voice tight with the kind of control that precedes an explosion. "We're asking you to help family, but I guess we know where your priorities are now." My priorities. As if my priority should be funding their children's enrichment activities, rather than ensuring I could afford my own medical expenses and housing security. "My priority," I said evenly, "is making sure I can take care of myself as I get older so I don't become a burden to anyone." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on me. I was already a burden to them, at least according to their regular comments about my presence and needs. But I was a burden who was expected to pay for the privilege of being barely tolerated. That conversation marked a turning point in the apartment's emotional climate. The small changes I had been making, taking pottery classes, reading books, declining automatic availability, had been noticed but tolerated. But refusing a financial request crossed a line into territory that felt threatening to them. Over the following days, I became aware of whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Meaningful looks exchanged between Michael and Sarah when they thought I wasn't paying attention. An overall atmosphere of tension that felt like the prelude to a confrontation. I continued my routines. Pottery class, library visits, neighborhood walks, but with growing awareness that something was building toward a crisis. Part of me dreaded the inevitable conflict, but another part of me felt ready for it in a way I never had before. The crisis came on a Thursday evening in March. I had returned from pottery class carrying my latest creation, a coffee mug I had painted with small flowers. Imperfect, but cheerful. I was proud of it in the uncomplicated way that comes from making something beautiful with your own hands. Michael was waiting for me in the living room, sitting in the leather armchair with the serious expression he used for difficult conversations. "Mom, we need to talk." Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face set in the determined lines of someone who has rehearsed what they're going to say. I set my pottery mug on the small table by my chair and sat down, hands folded in my lap, waiting. "Sarah and I have been talking," Michael began, "and we're concerned about some of the changes in your behavior lately. Changes in my behavior. Not growth, not independence, not rediscovered interests. Changes that concerned them because they disrupted the established order of my servitude. What changes? I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. You've become less cooperative, Sarah interjected, less willing to help with family responsibilities, more focused on your own interests than on being part of this household. Being part of this household had meant being available for unpaid labor and financial exploitation, while being excluded from decisions, celebrations, and genuine inclusion. Being part of this household had meant existing for their convenience while having no real voice or presence of my own. I've been taking pottery classes and reading books, I said. I wasn't aware that those activities were preventing me from contributing to the household. It's not the activities, Michael said. It's the attitude. You used to be so giving, so focused on family. Now you seem more concerned with yourself than with us. The accusation was devastating in its accuracy and its unfairness. Yes, I was more concerned with myself than I had been in years. Yes, I was less willing to sacrifice my own time, energy, and money for their comfort and convenience. These were positive developments in terms of my mental health and self-respect, but they were problems from the perspective of people who had grown accustomed to my self-negation. You're right, I said. I am more concerned with myself than I used to be. I'm trying to build a life that includes things I enjoy and value. At the expense of your family, Sarah said. What expense? The question came out sharper than I had intended. What specific expense to this family has resulted from me taking pottery classes or reading books? They looked at each other, clearly not having expected me to ask for concrete examples of how my growth had harmed them. It's not about specific things, Michael said finally. It's about attitude. It's about being selfish instead of thinking about others. Selfish. There was that word again. The ultimate accusation designed to make me feel guilty for having any needs or interests of my own. Michael, I said, looking directly at him, in the 3 years I've lived here, I've contributed thousands of dollars to your family's expenses. I've provided childcare, housekeeping, cooking, and maintenance without compensation. I've accommodated your schedules, your preferences, and your social needs even when they conflicted with my own comfort. Can you give me a single example of how I've been selfish? The silence stretched uncomfortably. They had expected guilt and immediate compliance, not a rational analysis of the situation. The pottery classes, Sarah said finally. You're spending money on pottery classes when Emma needs things for school. Emma's school needs are your responsibility as her parents, I replied. My pottery classes are my responsibility as an adult woman who deserves to have interests and activities that bring her joy. But you're part of this family, Michael said, his voice taking on the wheedling tone of someone who realizes their argument is weak but doesn't want to abandon it. Am I? The question surprised even me. Am I really part of this family, or am I just someone you house because it's convenient to have unpaid help available? The question hung in the air like smoke, making visible something that had been present but unacknowledged for years. Of course you're part of the family, Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. When was the last time I was included in making a family decision? I asked. When was the last time my preferences were considered in planning a family activity? When was the last time anyone in this family asked what I needed or wanted instead of telling me what you expected from me? They had no answers because the questions revealed the fundamental inequality of my position in their household. I was family when they needed something from me, but not family when it came to inclusion, consideration, or respect. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Sarah said, her voice rising slightly. This attitude of keeping score, of acting like we owe you something. Family doesn't work that way. You're right, I said. Family doesn't work by keeping score. Family works by mutual care and consideration and respect. But when only one person is doing the caring and considering and respecting, it stops being family and starts being exploitation. The word exploitation landed like a bomb. It named what had been happening without calling it what it was, and suddenly everyone in the room had to confront the reality of our relationships. That's a terrible thing to say, Michael said, and for the first time he sounded hurt rather than just frustrated. It's a terrible thing to experience, I replied. Do you think I wanted to realize that my son sees me as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved? I do love you, Mom. I know you do. But love isn't enough if it doesn't include respect. And love isn't real if it comes with conditions that require me to make myself smaller and smaller so that you can be comfortable. We sat in silence for several minutes, each of us processing the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. The apartment felt different, charged with the electricity that follows a lightning strike. So what do you want? Sarah asked finally. What did I want? It was the first time in years anyone had asked me that question, and I realized I had been afraid to ask it of myself. I want to be treated like a member of this family instead of like hired help who works for room and board, I said. I want my contributions to be appreciated rather than expected. I want to be consulted about decisions that affect me. I want my interests and activities to be respected rather than dismissed as embarrassing or selfish. And if we can't do that? The question came from Michael, and there was something in his voice that sounded like genuine curiosity rather than manipulation. Then I'll find somewhere that I can be treated with dignity. The conversation ended without resolution, but something fundamental had shifted. I had stated my needs clearly and without apology. I had named the problems in our relationship without taking responsibility for fixing them. I had set boundaries instead of just enduring violations. That night, I called Rose. "How did it go?" she asked immediately. "I told them the truth," I said. "I told them I want to be treated with respect or I'll leave. How do you feel?" I considered the question carefully. "Terrified," I said finally, "but also free. For the first time in years, I feel like I have choices." "You do have choices, sweetheart. You've always had choices. You just forgot for a while." Over the next few days, Michael and Sarah seemed to be making an effort to include me more in family conversations and decisions. Sarah asked my opinion about redecorating the living room. Michael invited me to join them for a family movie night. Small gestures that felt significant after years of being ignored. But I could sense the effort behind these changes, the conscious decision to perform inclusion rather than naturally offering it. And I found myself wondering whether relationships built on conscious effort to be decent were sustainable in the long term. The test came sooner than I expected. 2 weeks after our confrontation, Michael approached me with another financial request. Emma's school was organizing a trip to Washington, D.C., and while it wasn't as expensive as the summer program, it still required several $100s they claimed they couldn't afford. "I know we just talked about this," Michael said, "but this is educational, not just extracurricular. And we really can't swing it right now with everything else going on." Everything else going on included Sarah's weekly tennis lessons, dinners out twice a week, and Michael's plan to upgrade his phone to the latest model. But Emma's educational trip was apparently beyond their budget. "Have you looked into whether the school offers financial assistance for families who need it?" I asked. Michael looked surprised by the question. "I don't think we'd qualify." "You might be surprised. Many schools have funds specifically for educational trips because they recognize that all children deserve these experiences regardless of their family's financial situations." "But it would be easier if you just helped," Sarah called from the kitchen where she was obviously listening to our conversation. "Easier. Not better for Emma, not better for their family's financial management skills, not better for my own security. Just easier." "Easier for whom?" I asked. "For everyone," Michael said. "For Emma, so she doesn't have to worry about money. For us, so we don't have to go through the hassle of applying for assistance. For you, so you can do something nice for your granddaughter." The logic was seductive in its simplicity. Pay money, solve problem, everyone happy. Except that it wasn't my problem to solve, and paying money I needed for my own security to solve other people's problems hadn't actually made anyone happy. It had just made them more comfortable asking for more money. "I love Emma," I said, "and I want her to go on the trip. But I think it's important for you as her parents to handle this responsibility. And I think it might be good for Emma to learn that sometimes we have to work a little harder to get the things we want. So you won't help?" The question carried disappointment and accusation in equal measure. "I won't pay for the trip," I said, "but I'll help you research financial assistance options if you'd like." It wasn't the answer they wanted, and the temperature in the apartment dropped noticeably over the following days. Conversations became brief and functional. Invitations to family activities disappeared. The temporary effort to include me more in household decisions evaporated. I realized I was being punished for maintaining the boundaries I had established. The message was clear. Cooperation meant giving them whatever they wanted, and anything less than complete compliance would result in emotional withdrawal and social isolation. But instead of feeling devastated by this treatment, I felt oddly relieved. The pretense was over. We all knew where we stood now, and I could stop pretending that small gestures of inclusion meant genuine acceptance and respect. I increased my activities outside the apartment. In addition to pottery class, I joined a book club at the library and started volunteering at a local food bank. For the first time in years, I had a social life that existed independently of my family relationships. The other volunteers at the food bank were mostly retirees like myself, people who had raised families and built careers and were now looking for meaningful ways to spend their time. Working alongside them, I remembered what it felt like to be valued for my capabilities and contributions, rather than merely tolerated as an inconvenience. "You're good with people," observed Helen, a former social worker who managed the volunteer schedule. "Have you ever considered doing peer counseling? We have a program for seniors who want to help other seniors navigate family and housing issues." The idea appealed to me immediately. My own struggles with family dynamics and financial exploitation were far from unique, And perhaps I could help other elderly people recognize and address similar situations in their own lives. I enrolled in the training program, which met 2 evenings a week for 6 weeks. Learning about elder abuse, financial exploitation, and emotional manipulation in an academic context helped me understand my own experiences with startling clarity. Financial elder abuse often happens within families, the instructor explained during one session. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' resources sometimes don't recognize that they're engaging in exploitative behavior. They tell themselves they're just accepting help, even when that help comes at significant cost to the older person's security and well-being. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had contributed to Michael and Sarah's lifestyle over the years. The college expenses, the wedding costs, the down payment assistance, the constant stream of smaller requests that added up to a substantial transfer of wealth from my limited resources to their comfortable middle-class life. Had they ever considered the impact on my financial security? Had they ever thought about what I was giving up to provide what they were asking for? Or had they simply assumed that parents exist to give and children exist to receive, with no obligation for reciprocity or consideration? Emotional elder abuse is often more subtle, the instructor continued. It can include isolation, dismissal of the older person's needs and preferences, constant criticism disguised as concern, and making the older person feel guilty for having normal human needs for respect and inclusion. The description fit my daily experience so precisely that I felt exposed, as if everyone in the room could see my shame and recognition. During the break, I found myself talking with another participant, a woman named Dorothy, who was probably 10 years older than me. "It's hard to admit when it's happening to you," she said quietly, "especially when it's your own children doing it." "Are you—" I hesitated to ask such a personal question. "Living with my daughter and her husband," Dorothy nodded. "Same story as a lot of us here, I think. Gave them everything when they were younger. And now that I need support, I'm made to feel like a burden for existing. At the same time, they're living in the house I helped them buy." We talked after class, sharing stories that were heartbreakingly similar. Adult children who had accepted financial help as their due when they were establishing their lives, but who now treated their aging parents as inconvenient obligations rather than beloved family members. "The hardest part," Dorothy said, "is that I keep thinking I must be doing something wrong. If I were a better mother, a more grateful houseguest, a less demanding person, maybe they'd treat me better." "But you shouldn't have to earn basic respect and kindness," I said, and as I spoke the words, I realized I was talking to myself as much as to her. "I know that intellectually," Dorothy replied, "but when you're living in someone else's house, dependent on their tolerance for your presence, it's hard to maintain your dignity." That conversation stayed with me for days afterward. Dorothy had articulated something I hadn't been able to name: the impossible position of being financially dependent on people who made it clear that your presence was unwelcome while simultaneously expecting you to be grateful for their grudging accommodation. I started thinking seriously about Rose's offer to let me live with her in Brooklyn. The couch bed wasn't ideal, and I would still be dependent on someone else's generosity for housing. But there was a fundamental difference between being welcomed into Rose's home as a loved sister and being barely tolerated in Michael's apartment as an inconvenient obligation. The decision crystallized unexpectedly on a Tuesday evening in early April. I had returned from my volunteer training session energized by the evening's discussion of advocacy strategies for seniors facing housing instability. I was looking forward to making a cup of tea in my pottery mug and reading one of the books I had borrowed from the library. But as I approached the apartment building, I could see lights on in our unit and hear voices that suggested Michael and Sarah were entertaining guests. I climbed the stairs quietly, hoping to slip into my small room without interrupting their social evening. The apartment door was slightly ajar, and as I reached for the handle, I heard my name mentioned in the conversation inside. "Just don't understand why she's being so difficult all of a sudden," Sarah was saying. "She used to be so helpful and grateful, and now she acts like we owe her something." "Older people can become very stubborn," replied a voice I recognized as belonging to Harold, Sarah's father. "They get set in their ways and resistant to reasonable expectations." "The thing is," Michael said, "we've been incredibly generous letting her live here. She contributes almost nothing to household expenses, and she takes up space we could use for other purposes. Almost nothing to household expenses. I thought about the hundreds of dollars I had paid toward utilities, groceries, and household supplies over the past 3 years, the money I had contributed to their children's expenses and their own entertainment and lifestyle costs, the value of the unpaid labor I had provided in cooking, cleaning, and childcare. Almost nothing. "Maybe it's time to start looking at other arrangements," Margaret, Sarah's mother, suggested. "Assisted living facilities are really quite nice these days, and she might be happier with people her own age." "We've thought about that," Sarah said, but she'd have to qualify for Medicaid to afford it, and that would mean spending down her savings first. It would be more convenient for everyone if she could just go back to being cooperative. They were discussing my future as if I were a household management problem rather than a family member with feelings and rights. They wanted me to be more cooperative so they could continue housing me cheaply while benefiting from my financial contributions and unpaid labor. And if I couldn't be managed back into compliance, they were prepared to place me in institutional care that would consume whatever savings I had left. I stood in the hallway listening to my son and his in-laws plan my life around their convenience, and something inside me finally broke free completely. I walked past the partially open door without entering, went downstairs, and left the building. I walked through Manhattan streets I barely saw, my mind spinning with the reality of what I had overheard. They didn't love me. They didn't even like me. I was a problem to be managed, a resource to be exploited, an inconvenience to be endured until they could find a way to dispose of me that didn't make them look bad to their friends and colleagues. All the small changes I had made, all the boundaries I had tried to establish, all the attempts to reclaim my dignity within their household, none of it mattered because they fundamentally did not see me as a person deserving of respect and consideration. I found myself at a coffee shop near Columbia University, surrounded by students who were younger than Michael had been when I sacrificed my house to help pay for his education. I sat in a corner booth with a cup of coffee I didn't want, watching these young people laugh and argue and dream about their futures. When Michael was their age, I had believed I was investing in a future that would include me. I had believed that love and sacrifice would create bonds strong enough to sustain us both through whatever challenges life might bring. I had believed in family as a source of mutual support and care that transcended financial calculations and convenience. I had been wrong, not wrong about Michael's potential. He had indeed built a successful career and comfortable life. Not wrong about the value of education and opportunity. Emma and James were thriving children with bright futures ahead of them. But wrong about what my role would be in the life I had helped him create. I called Rose from the coffee shop. "I want to take you up on your offer," I said without preamble when she answered. "Which offer?" "Living with you in Brooklyn, if it's still available." There was a pause, and I could hear the television being turned down in the background. "What happened?" Rose asked. I found myself crying as I tried to explain what I had overheard. The casual discussion of my future as if I were furniture to be rearranged rather than a person with agency and feeling. "Oh, sweetheart," Rose said when I finished. "Come home. Come home right now." Home. Not to her apartment, not to Brooklyn, not to the couch bed that would be my temporary refuge. Home. I took a taxi to Brooklyn that night, leaving Manhattan with only my purse and the clothes I was wearing. Everything else? My few remaining possessions, my pottery mug, my library books, the photos that documented a lifetime of loving and giving, remained in the small room off Michael's kitchen. Rose was waiting for me with hot chocolate and tissues, and the kind of unconditional acceptance I had forgotten was possible. "Do you want to talk about it tonight, or do you want to sleep first?" she asked. "Sleep," I said. "I want to sleep without listening for sounds that mean someone needs something from me." I slept for 14 hours and woke up to sunshine streaming through Rose's living room windows and the smell of coffee brewing in her kitchen. For the first time in months, no one had woken me early with demands or expectations. No one needed me to start their day by managing their needs and schedules. "Michael called 4 times last night," Rose said as she handed me a cup of coffee. I didn't answer. "He's probably worried about his free childcare and household labor disappearing," I said, and was surprised by the bitterness in my own voice. "Maybe," Rose said, "or maybe he's worried about his mother." I wanted to believe that Michael's concern was genuine, but the conversation I had overheard made it clear that his primary concern was maintaining arrangements that benefited him rather than ensuring my happiness and well-being. My phone started ringing at 8 o'clock. Michael, then Sarah, then Michael again. I let all the calls go to voicemail but listened to the messages later in the day. "Mom, where are you? Your bed wasn't slept in and all your things are still here. Please call me back when you get this. Mrs. Peterson, this is Sarah. Michael is very worried about you. If you're upset about something, we should talk about it like adults instead of you just disappearing. Mom, it's me again." Rose isn't answering her phone either. "I'm starting to think about calling the police. Please just let us know you're okay." The progression from worry to irritation to threat was revealing. Michael was genuinely concerned about my physical safety, but Sarah's message revealed that my emotional state was less important than maintaining adult behavior that didn't inconvenience them. And the threat to involve police suggested that they expected to be able to control my movements and choices. "Should I call him back?" I asked Rose. "Do you want to talk to him?" I considered the question seriously. Did I want to have another conversation where I tried to explain my need for respect and dignity, while he explained why my expectations were unreasonable? Did I want to negotiate for changes that would last only as long as it took him to fall back into old patterns of taking me for granted? Not yet, I said. I need time to think about what I actually want, not just what I'm trying to get away from. Rose respected my decision without question, which itself was a radical change from living with people who felt entitled to explanations and justifications for my choices. I spent the next few days settling into Rose's apartment and into a routine that prioritized my own needs and interests rather than other people's expectations. I called the pottery instructor to explain that I would be missing classes for a while. I contacted the library to extend my volunteer schedule. I made appointments with a doctor Rose recommended and with a legal aid lawyer who specialized in elder issues. The legal consultation was both reassuring and sobering. I had rights that Michael and Sarah couldn't violate, but I also had responsibilities for my own financial security that I had been neglecting in my eagerness to help them build their comfortable life. Do you have documentation of the money you've given them over the years? The lawyer asked. I did have some records, canceled checks, bank statements, receipts, but many of the transactions had been informal, presented as temporary loans or family assistance rather than gifts. The legal reality was that most of the money was irretrievably gone unless I could prove it had been given under false pretenses or through coercion. The more important question, the lawyer said, is what you want your relationship with your son to look like going forward. Do you want to remain connected, but with clear boundaries? Do you want a complete break? Do you want to try mediation to establish new terms for your interaction? I didn't know the answer to that question yet, but I knew I needed to decide from a position of emotional stability and clear thinking, rather than from the desperation and guilt that had governed my choices for so long. Michael's calls continued daily for the first week, then tapered off to every few days. The messages evolved from worry to frustration to what sounded like genuine reflection. Mom, I've been thinking about what you said before you left, about respect and being treated like family. I think maybe we did take you for granted, and I'm sorry about that. Could we talk about what would need to change for you to feel comfortable coming home? Home. He called his apartment home, as if it had ever truly been my home, rather than a place where I was housed in exchange for services and financial contributions. But there was something different in his voice, a quality of actual listening that hadn't been present in our previous conversations. For the first time, he seemed to be considering my perspective, rather than just trying to manage my behavior. I decided to call him back. Mom, thank God, was the first thing he said when he heard my voice. Are you okay? Are you safe? I'm fine. I'm staying with Rose. Why didn't you just tell us you were unhappy? We could have worked something out. The question revealed how little he had actually heard during our previous conversations. I had told them I was unhappy. I had explained specifically what I needed to change. I had set boundaries and asked for respect. But those conversations had been dismissed as problems with my attitude, rather than legitimate concerns about my treatment. Michael, I said, I did tell you I was unhappy. Several times. But every time I tried to talk about changes that would help me feel more respected and included, you and Sarah treated it as evidence that I was being selfish and difficult. There was a long pause. I guess we didn't really listen, he said finally. No, you didn't. What would it take for you to come back? The question was complex and painful because it assumed that coming back was what I wanted, rather than considering that I might have discovered I was happier living elsewhere. I don't know if I want to come back, I said honestly. I've been happier this week than I've been in months. I wake up in the morning without dreading the day ahead. I make decisions about how to spend my time based on what interests me rather than what other people need from me. I feel like myself again for the first time in years. But we're your family. Being family isn't just about genetics, Michael. It's about how people treat each other. It's about mutual respect and care and consideration. And for the past few years, I felt more like household staff than like family. I could hear him talking to Sarah in the background. Their voices too low for me to understand the words, but high enough to suggest tension and disagreement. Sarah wants to talk to you, Michael said when he came back to the phone. I want to talk to Sarah too, I said, though I wasn't sure that was true. Mrs. Peterson. Sarah's voice was carefully controlled, the tone she used when she was trying to sound reasonable and mature. I think there have been some misunderstandings on both sides. Misunderstandings, as if the problem was communication failure rather than fundamental disrespect and exploitation. I don't think there have been misunderstandings, Sarah. I think there have been differences in what we consider acceptable treatment. We've always tried to make you feel welcome in our home. Have you? The question came out more sharply than I had intended. Have you made me feel welcome, or have you made me feel tolerated as long as I was useful? Another pause. Sarah was clearly not accustomed to being challenged directly. I think you may be misinterpreting some things, she said finally. We appreciate everything you've done for our family. Do you appreciate it? Or do you expect it? I don't understand the difference. And there it was. Sarah genuinely couldn't understand the difference between appreciation and expectation, between gratitude and entitlement. To her, my contributions were simply what grandmothers did, what aging parents owed to their adult children, what older women provided in exchange for housing and minimal inclusion. The difference, I said, is that appreciated contributions are acknowledged and valued, while expected contributions are taken for granted and treated as obligations rather than gifts. I could hear Michael saying something in the background, but Sarah continued without acknowledging him. Mrs. Peterson, I think you're being unfair. We never asked you to contribute more than you could comfortably afford. The lie was so blatant that I felt breathless for a moment. They had repeatedly asked for money I couldn't comfortably afford, had pressured me when I hesitated, had made me feel guilty and selfish when I declined to give them funds I needed for my own security. Sarah, I said, in December you asked me to contribute $5,000 to Emma's summer program. $5,000 is more than half of my remaining savings. How is that something I could comfortably afford? We thought you wanted to invest in Emma's future. I do want Emma to have wonderful opportunities, but it's not my responsibility to fund them, and it's not reasonable to expect me to compromise my own financial security to pay for enrichment activities that you as her parents should be providing. The conversation continued for another few minutes, but it became clear that Sarah was not capable of understanding my perspective. She maintained that they had been generous in housing me, that I was being ungrateful and selfish, and that my expectations were unreasonable given my dependent status. When Michael came back on the phone, he sounded tired and frustrated. Mom, I don't know how to fix this. You can't fix it by trying to change my mind or convince me that I'm wrong, I said. You can only fix it by genuinely examining how I've been treated and making real changes in how you interact with me. What kind of changes? It was the first time he had asked that question as if my answer mattered rather than as if he was gathering information to argue against. I need to be included in family decisions that affect me, not just informed about decisions you've already made. I need my contributions to be appreciated rather than expected. I need my interests and activities to be respected rather than dismissed. I need to be treated like a family member with rights and agency rather than like a dependent who should be grateful for whatever accommodation I receive. That sounds reasonable, Michael said, and there was something in his voice that gave me hope for the first time in weeks. It is reasonable, but it requires you and Sarah to see me differently than you have been, and I don't know if that's possible. Can we try? I wanted to say yes immediately, to rush back to Manhattan and resume the relationship with new hope and determination. But I had learned something important during my week with Rose. I deserve to be wanted, not just needed. I deserve to be valued, not just accommodated. I need more time to think about what I want, I said, and you need real time to examine how you've been treating me and decide whether you're willing and able to make genuine changes. How much time? I don't know. Weeks, maybe months. This isn't just about hurt feelings, Michael. This is about whether we can build a relationship based on mutual respect or whether we're incompatible in terms of what we need and expect from family. We agreed that I would stay with Rose while we both considered what kind of relationship might be possible between us. Michael would talk with Sarah about the specific changes that would be necessary for me to feel respected in their home. I would work with my therapist and legal advisor to clarify what I needed for my own emotional and financial security. It felt both hopeful and terrifying to put our relationship on hold while we figured out whether it could be salvaged. The weeks that followed were simultaneously healing and challenging. Living with Rose meant rediscovering parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I resumed my pottery classes at a studio near her apartment. I joined a book club that met in a cafe in Park Slope. I volunteered at a community center that served meals to seniors who might otherwise eat alone. I also started therapy with a counselor who specialized in family dynamics and elder care issues. Dr. Martinez was a woman about my own age who had worked with many families struggling to navigate the complex emotions and practical challenges of intergenerational living. It's common for adult children to develop a sense of entitlement to their parents' resources, she explained during one of our sessions. Especially when parents have been generous in the past, they stop seeing financial and practical assistance as gifts and start seeing them as rights. But how do you change that dynamic once it's established? I asked. Usually, you can't change it within the same living arrangement that created it, she said. The patterns are too entrenched, the roles too fixed. Real change requires disrupting the system enough that everyone has to consciously choose new ways of interacting. That observation made me realize why my attempts to establish boundaries within Michael's apartment had been largely unsuccessful. The physical environment and established routines reinforced old patterns of interaction. making it almost impossible to sustain new ways of relating to each other. Dr. Martinez also helped me understand that my desire to be loved and accepted had sometimes prevented me from recognizing when I was being exploited. My fear of loneliness had made me willing to accept treatment that was damaging to my self-respect and financial security. There's a difference between interdependence and exploitation, she said. Healthy interdependence involves mutual benefit and voluntary participation. Exploitation involves one party benefiting at significant cost to the other, usually with some form of coercion or manipulation to maintain the arrangement. By that definition, my relationship with Michael and Sarah had clearly crossed the line from interdependence into exploitation. They had benefited enormously from my financial contributions and unpaid labor, while I had received housing that came with conditions that compromised my dignity and autonomy. Meanwhile, Michael had been calling weekly with updates on his conversations with Sarah and his reflections on our family dynamics. The reports were mixed but seemed to show genuine effort at self-examination. Sarah admits that we probably did take you for granted, he said during one call. She says she thought you liked being helpful and didn't realize you felt unappreciated. What do you think? I asked. I think we got comfortable with you always saying yes to everything we asked, and when you started saying no, we didn't know how to adjust. It was progress, but I wasn't sure it was enough. Recognizing past mistakes was important, but changing future behavior required more than just awareness of problems. Michael, I said, do you miss me being there? Or do you miss the things I used to do for you? The question clearly caught him off guard, and he was quiet for a long time before answering. Both, he said finally. But I'm starting to realize that missing the things you did without missing you as a person is pretty terrible. That conversation gave me more hope than anything he had said previously. For the first time, he seemed to understand that his relationship with me had become primarily transactional rather than genuinely affectionate. After 2 months of separation and reflection, Michael asked if we could meet for lunch to talk about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship. I agreed, but I chose a restaurant in Brooklyn near Rose's apartment, rather than meeting him in Manhattan. I wanted to remain on my own territory, in a place where I felt confident and secure. He looked different when I saw him waiting at the restaurant table. Older somehow, less confident than he usually appeared. The successful Manhattan professional facade was still there, but underneath it, I could see traces of the boy he had been before life taught him that his needs mattered more than other people's feelings. You look good, Mom, he said as I sat down across from him, rested. I feel good, I said, better than I have in a long time. I've been thinking about what you said, about the difference between being needed and being wanted, and I realized that for a long time, we related to you more like a service provider than like family. The acknowledgement was both painful and healing. Painful because it confirmed what I had known but hadn't wanted to believe. Healing because it meant he was finally seeing our relationship clearly instead of through the filter of his own needs and assumptions. I miss you, he continued. Not just the things you did for us, but you. I miss talking to you, hearing about your pottery classes, even arguing with you about books you're reading. I didn't realize until you left how much of your personality we had trained you to hide. That observation hit me like a physical blow. He was right. I had learned to make myself smaller and quieter over the years, suppressing interests and opinions that might create conflict or take up too much space in households that didn't really have room for my full presence. The thing is, I said carefully, I don't know if I can go back to living the way I was before. I've remembered what it feels like to be myself, and I don't want to give that up again. What if you didn't have to give it up? What do you mean? What if instead of you moving back into our apartment, we all figured out a way for you to stay connected to our family while maintaining your independence? The suggestion was so unexpected that I couldn't respond immediately. I had been thinking in terms of either returning to the status quo or maintaining complete separation. The idea of staying connected while remaining independent hadn't occurred to me as a possibility. Sarah and I have been looking at apartments in Brooklyn, Michael continued. Nothing definite, but we're thinking about relocating out of Manhattan anyway. The kids would have more space, we'd save money on rent, and you could have your own place nearby instead of living with us. Your own place nearby sounded like paradise after years of occupying a storage closet off someone else's kitchen. We've also been talking about the financial stuff, Michael said, looking embarrassed. About all the money you've given us over the years. We can't pay it all back immediately, but we want to start making regular payments toward what we owe you. What we owe you. He was finally acknowledging that my financial contributions had been loans rather than gifts. Money that belonged to me even though I had chosen to share it with them. And we want to pay you for the childcare and housework you did while you were living with us. Not just token amounts, but actual wages for the work you contributed. The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering practical details and emotional concerns with a level of honesty and mutual respect that had been missing from our communications for years. Michael asked questions about my needs and preferences instead of just telling me about decisions that had already been made. He acknowledged specific ways that Sarah and he had failed to treat me with dignity and consideration. Most importantly, he seemed to understand that rebuilding our relationship would require ongoing effort and attention, rather than just good intentions and temporary changes. "I can't promise we'll get everything right," he said as we prepared to leave the restaurant. "But I can promise that we'll keep trying to do better and that we'll listen when you tell us something isn't working." It wasn't everything I had hoped for, but it was more than I had expected. For the first time in years, I felt like I was talking to my son, rather than negotiating with someone who saw me as a problem to be managed. Over the following months, Michael and Sarah did indeed relocate to Brooklyn, finding a house in Cobble Hill that was large enough for their family, while being close enough to Rose's apartment that I could easily visit or babysit when I chose to, rather than when it was expected of me. I found my own studio apartment 6 blocks from Rose, small but bright and entirely my own. For the first time in decades, I was living independently, making my own decisions about everything from what to eat for breakfast to how to spend my evenings. The financial arrangements took longer to establish, but Michael kept his promise to begin payments toward what they owed me. The amounts were modest, but they represented acknowledgement of debt rather than charity, and that distinction felt crucial to rebuilding trust between us. More importantly, our interactions gradually shifted from obligation-based to affection-based. Michael and the children visited because they wanted to see me, not because they needed something from me. Sarah made genuine efforts to include me in family conversations and decisions, asking for my opinions and actually considering them rather than just soliciting pro forma input. I continued my pottery classes and volunteer work, building a life that was rich and fulfilling independent of my family relationships. When I spent time with Michael and his family, it was because I enjoyed their company, not because I had nowhere else to go or no other source of social connection. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. Old patterns of interaction died hard, especially during times of stress or conflict. But the fundamental shift from exploitation to mutual respect made it possible to address problems when they arose rather than letting resentments build until they became unbearable. 6 months after our lunch meeting, Emma asked if I would teach her to make pottery. We spent Saturday afternoons at the studio I attended, working side by side with Clay while talking about school and friends and her dreams for the future. "Grandma," she said during one of these sessions, "I'm glad you moved to your own apartment." "Why?" I asked, curious about her perspective on our family's changes. "Because now when you visit, it feels special instead of like you're just around all the time, and you seem happier." Out of the mouths of babes. Emma had articulated something that had taken me months of therapy to understand. My constant availability had made me less valuable, rather than more valuable to the people in my life. By insisting on my own space and independence, I had actually become a more treasured presence in their lives. That evening, I sat in my small apartment looking out at the Brooklyn street scene below my window. Children were playing in the small park across the way, their parents chatting on benches while keeping watchful eyes on their active offspring. The scene was peaceful and community-oriented in a way that reminded me of the neighborhood where Michael had grown up, where neighbors knew each other and looked out for each other without formal obligations or resentments. I thought about the conversation I had overheard that night in Manhattan, the casual discussion of my future as if I were a burden to be disposed of, rather than a person with agency and rights. That moment of devastation had ultimately led to this moment of contentment, but the journey between them had required courage I hadn't been sure I possessed. My phone rang, interrupting my reflections. It was Michael, calling to thank me for babysitting that afternoon while he and Sarah attended a work event. "The kids had a wonderful time," he said. "Emma showed me the bowl she's making in pottery class with you. She's so proud of it." "She's very talented," I said. "And she's good company." "Mom," Michael said, his voice taking on the serious tone that meant he had been thinking about something important. "I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again. I'm sorry about how we treated you when you were living with us, and I'm grateful that you gave us another chance to figure out how to be family in a better way. We're all learning," I said. "The important thing is that we're willing to keep trying." After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea in the pottery mug I had rescued from Michael's apartment during one of my visits. It was imperfect and handmade, created during those early pottery classes, when I was first rediscovering what it meant to have interests and activities that were purely my own. I thought about Dorothy, the woman from my elder advocacy training class who had struggled with similar family dynamics. I had run into her recently at the grocery store, and she had shared that she had finally found the courage to move into senior housing where she was treated with respect and had opportunities for friendship and independence. The hardest part, she had said, was accepting that loving my family didn't require sacrificing my dignity, and that they might actually love me more when I insisted on being treated well. As I sat with my tea, watching the lights come on in apartments across the street, I felt profound gratitude for the series of small decisions that had led me from that empty room in Manhattan to this small but fully my own space in Brooklyn. The journey had required letting go of fantasies about what family relationships should look like and accepting the reality of what was actually possible with the people in my life. But it had also required recognizing my own worth and insisting that others recognize it too. The pottery classes, the volunteer work, the therapy, the legal consultation, the gradual process of building independence. Each step had been necessary to create space for healthier relationships to develop. I finished my tea and prepared for bed, no longer listening for sounds that might indicate someone needed something from me. Tomorrow I would visit Rose for lunch, attend my book club meeting, and work on a new pottery project that existed purely because I enjoyed the process of creating something beautiful with my own hands. It was a life measured in small pleasures and genuine connections rather than constant service to other people's needs. It was the life I should have been living all along, and it was the life I planned to keep living for whatever years remained to me. The story could end there, with reconciliation and wisdom and the satisfaction of transformation achieved through courage and persistence. But life rarely provides such tidy endings, and the real test of change comes not in moments of crisis and decision, but in the daily choices that either reinforce new patterns or allow old ones to creep back in. The Christmas after our family restructuring was the first holiday in years where I felt genuinely excited rather than anxious about spending time with Michael and his family. I had my own apartment to return to if the gathering became overwhelming, my own traditions and preferences that didn't have to be subordinated to other people's expectations. Sarah had asked if I wanted to host Christmas dinner in my small studio, a suggestion that revealed how little she understood about space and logistics, but also showed genuine effort to include me in holiday planning. I declined graciously and suggested we meet at a restaurant that specialized in traditional holiday meals, removing the burden of cooking and cleanup from any individual family member. The meal was relaxed and enjoyable in a way that family gatherings hadn't been for years. Emma and James were excited to share their school achievements and holiday plans without the tension that had previously characterized our interactions. Michael asked about my pottery and volunteer work with genuine interest rather than polite obligation. Most tellingly, when James spilled grape juice on his shirt and started crying about the stain, multiple adults responded to comfort him instead of everyone looking to me to handle the crisis. It was a small moment, but it reflected the larger shift in family dynamics away from my automatic responsibility for every problem or need. After dinner, we exchanged gifts with consideration and moderation. I gave pottery pieces I had made specifically for each family member, a mug for Michael's morning coffee, a serving bowl for Sarah's dinner parties, small cups for the children's hot chocolate. They gave me books, art supplies, and a beautiful scarf that reflected actual knowledge of my tastes and interests. But the gift that meant the most came from Michael at the end of the evening. "Mom," he said, handing me an envelope, "this isn't really a Christmas present. It's something we should have done months ago." Inside the envelope was a check for $3,000 and a letter acknowledging the total amount they calculated they owed me for loans and unpaid labor over the past several years. It wasn't full restitution. That would have been financially impossible for them, but it was a concrete acknowledgement of debt and a payment plan that would gradually restore what I had given up for their benefit. "You don't have to do this," I said, though I was deeply moved by both the gesture and the amount. "Yes, we do," Sarah said firmly. "We took advantage of your generosity for too long. This doesn't make up for everything, but it's a start." That night, I returned to my own apartment with a heart full of gratitude and hope. For the first time in years, I felt like I had family who valued me as a person, rather than as a resource, who saw me as someone deserving of respect and consideration, rather than someone whose primary purpose was meeting their needs. But the real test came in the following months, as the novelty of our new arrangements faded, and we settled into long-term patterns of relating to each other. There were setbacks and misunderstandings. Sarah occasionally reverted to treating me like free babysitting service rather than asking if I was available and interested in spending time with the children. Michael sometimes forgot to consult me about plans that affected me, making assumptions about my availability that echoed old patterns of taking me for granted. But the crucial difference was that these lapses became topics for conversation rather than sources of silent resentment. When Sarah called asking if I could watch Emma and James on short notice because their regular babysitter was sick, I was able to say that I had book club that evening but could help them find alternative childcare. Instead of responding with guilt or manipulation, Sarah apologized for the last-minute request and asked if I might be available another time when she could give more advance notice. The interaction lasted less than 5 minutes but reflected the fundamental shift in our relationship from expectation to negotiation. When Michael planned a family weekend trip without asking if I wanted to join them, I was able to mention that I would have enjoyed being included in their planning conversation, even if I had ultimately decided not to go. He immediately recognized the oversight and made sure to include me in future discussions about family activities, respecting my autonomy to decline while offering genuine invitations rather than assumptions about my availability. These small corrections and adjustments became normal parts of our family interactions, rather than dramatic confrontations about respect and dignity. We had created space for honest communication about needs and preferences, which made it possible to address problems while they were still small and manageable. Spring arrived with a burst of cherry blossoms in Brooklyn's parks, and a new pottery exhibition at the studio where I took classes. Several of my pieces had been selected for display, including the blue bowl that had become symbolic of my journey toward independence and self-respect. Emma insisted on attending the opening reception, dragging her parents and brother to see Grandma's famous pottery. Standing in the gallery space surrounded by beautiful ceramic pieces created by amateur artists like myself, I felt a pride and satisfaction that had nothing to do with other people's approval or need. "You're really good at this, Mom," Michael said, examining a vase I had glazed in deep greens and blues. "I had no idea you were so artistic." "I didn't either," I admitted. I never had time to find out before. The comment led to a longer conversation about dreams deferred and talents unexplored, about the ways that women of my generation had often been expected to prioritize other people's development over their own growth and creativity. "It's not too late, though," Emma said with the matter-of-fact wisdom of an 11-year-old. "You can still do lots of new things." She was right, of course. At 73, I might not have decades of artistic development ahead of me, but I had years of potential creativity and learning that would never have been possible if I had remained trapped in relationships based on exploitation and self-sacrifice. That summer, I did something I hadn't done since my honeymoon with Robert 47 years earlier. I took a vacation purely for my own enjoyment. Rose and I spent a week at a small bed and breakfast in Vermont, hiking gentle trails through mountain forests and visiting local artists' studios. The trip wasn't expensive or exotic, but it represented something revolutionary in terms of my relationship with my own life. I was spending money on my own pleasure without guilt. I was making decisions based on my own interests without considering whether anyone else needed my time or attention. I was being selfish in the healthiest possible way. Michael called while I was away, not because he needed anything, but because he wanted to hear about my adventures and share news about the children's summer activities. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering topics from local hiking trails to Emma's progress in pottery class to James's excitement about starting middle school in the fall. It was the kind of conversation I had dreamed of having with him for years. Relaxed, mutual, based on genuine interest in each other's lives rather than obligation or guilt. When we hung up, I realized I was looking forward to seeing him and his family when I returned to Brooklyn, excited to share photos of my trip and hear about their recent experiences. That evening, Rose and I sat on the inn's porch watching the sunset over the mountains and reflecting on the journeys that had brought us to this moment of contentment and freedom. "Do you ever regret leaving Michael's apartment?" she asked. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the pain and disruption that had been necessary to reclaim my dignity and independence? Did I wish I could have found a way to be happy accepting treatment that diminished my worth and agency? "I regret that it took me so long to recognize what was happening," I said finally. "And I regret that Michael and I lost years when we could have had a healthier relationship if I had been braver about insisting on respect from the beginning." "But you're not sorry you left?" "No," I said with absolute certainty. "Leaving was the best thing I've done for myself and for my relationship with my son. We're all happier now." The truth of that statement still surprised me sometimes. Michael and Sarah were happier too, freed from the unconscious burden of managing someone whose needs they had never learned to see clearly. Emma and James had a grandmother who was present by choice rather than obligation, who brought energy and enthusiasm to their interactions rather than resignation and exhaustion. Everyone had benefited when I finally insisted on being treated with dignity, even the people who had initially resisted the changes. As the summer ended and fall approached, I found myself settling into routines and relationships that felt sustainable for the long term. My pottery skills continued to develop, and I was asked to assist with beginner classes at the studio. My volunteer work at the community center expanded to include peer counseling for other seniors navigating family conflicts and housing challenges. Most importantly, my relationship with Michael's family continued to evolve in positive directions. When Emma started middle school and struggled with social pressures and academic demands, she began calling me regularly to talk through her concerns. Not because her parents weren't available, but because she found our conversations helpful and our relationship comfortable. "Grandma," she said during one of these calls, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "When you were my age, did you ever feel like you had to be perfect all the time to make people happy?" The question revealed that Emma was grappling with some of the same issues that had shaped my own life: the tendency to prioritize other people's comfort over her own needs, the fear that being herself might make her less lovable. "Yes," I said honestly. "And it took me a very long time to learn that people who really love you want you to be yourself, not perfect." We talked for over an hour about authenticity and boundaries, about the difference between kindness and people-pleasing, about the importance of respecting herself enough to expect respect from others. It was the kind of conversation I wished I had been able to have with an older woman when I was Emma's age, and I felt profound gratitude that I was now in a position to offer such guidance. When Michael called the next day to thank me for helping Emma through a difficult period, I realized that our family relationships had come full circle. Instead of me constantly giving while others mostly took, we had developed genuine reciprocity. I provided wisdom and support when it was needed and welcomed, while they offered practical help and emotional connection that enriched my own life. "Emma said you talked to her about standing up for herself," Michael said. "I think she really needed to hear that from someone other than her parents." "She's a wonderful girl," I said. "Smart and thoughtful. She reminded me of myself at her age, except she's learning things at 12 that took me 70 years to figure out." "Maybe she won't make some of the mistakes we made," Michael said quietly. By we, he meant himself and Sarah, but also me, the mistake of allowing family relationships to become unhealthy through failure to maintain appropriate boundaries and mutual respect. "Maybe not," I agreed. "We can hope." That conversation took place almost exactly 1 year after I had overheard Michael and Sarah discussing my future, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be loved. The contrast between that memory and our current relationship felt like a miracle, except that I knew it wasn't miraculous. It was the result of hard work, difficult conversations, and the courage to risk loneliness in order to demand dignity. Now, as I write this reflection on my journey from exploitation to independence, I am sitting in my own small apartment on a Saturday morning in early December. Snow is falling outside my window, and I have pottery class this afternoon, followed by dinner with Rose and 2 other friends from our book club. Michael will pick me up tomorrow morning for our monthly family breakfast, a tradition we established over the summer that gives us regular opportunities to connect without the pressure of major holidays or special occasions. Emma and James always have stories to share about school and friends, and I usually bring a new pottery piece or photos from recent activities. These gatherings are relaxed and genuine in a way that family time had never been during the years when I lived with them. We enjoy each other's company because we choose to spend time together, not because obligation or convenience binds us to unwelcome interactions. I am 74 years old now, and I understand that the years ahead may bring health challenges and increased need for support from family and community. But I face that future with confidence that I have established relationships based on mutual respect rather than exploitation, reciprocity rather than one-sided giving. If I need help as I age, I will receive it as someone who deserves care and consideration, not as someone grateful for any accommodation I might receive. If I become less able to contribute practically to my family's life, I will still be valued for who I am rather than dismissed as a burden once my usefulness has ended. These assurances exist because I found the courage to leave a situation where I was treated poorly, even though leaving meant risking the loss of family relationships that were precious to me despite their toxicity. By insisting on dignity, I created space for love to flourish without the poison of resentment and exploitation. The pottery mug I made in my 3rd class sits on the table beside me as I write. Imperfect but beautiful, functional and meaningful. It represents transformation, creativity, and the radical act of prioritizing my own development and satisfaction. Like all the best things in my life now, it exists not because someone else needed it from me, but because I wanted to create it for myself. If you've lived through something similar, being invisible in your own home, being taken for granted by people who claim to love you, giving everything you have while receiving little respect in return, know that you are not alone. Know that you deserve better. Know that it's never too late to insist on dignity, even when that insistence requires courage you're not sure you possess. Have you or someone you know experienced the painful realization that family love sometimes comes with conditions that diminish your worth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe so these messages can reach others who might need to hear them. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves and our families is to refuse to accept less than we deserve.